Hello, I'm Ted Pike, and this is my wife, Lynn. In 1988, an evangelical pastor in Sweden opened his Bible to the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. He informed his congregation, which included a homosexual, that God is still angry at sexual perversion and will judge those who practice it. Several months later, this pastor was serving a sentence in jail. He had violated Sweden's anti-hate statute, a law that protects groups such as homosexuals from verbal violence. Verbal violence includes public statements which might cause them embarrassment because of their sexual orientation.
It is well known that socialist Sweden is the trendsetter in human engineering. What happens there will probably be taken for granted through much of the world 10 or 15 years later. But laws in America banning criticism of others? It can't happen, most will reply. Not with free speech guaranteed by the Constitution, but it can. A hidden agenda toward ultimately restricting free speech surfaced among bills introduced in Congress in the summer of 2000. Hate crimes legislation was proposed as a first step toward banishing prejudice in America. This bill, deceptively titled the Local Law Enforcement Enhancement Act of 2000, passed the Senate, but was voted down in the House. If it had passed, it could have laid the foundation for an anti-hate bureaucracy identical to Sweden's, a bureaucracy which would redefine prejudice so as to make the Christian a lawbreaker.
But the threat is not over. As Congress has reconvened in 2001, the backers of this bill, undaunted, have resubmitted another very similar bill. Here's how our free speech is coming under attack. Anti-hate legislation is the brainchild of the ultra-powerful Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith, or ADL. In this building behind me is the Seattle branch of the ADL, one of 30 nationwide local branches. Like spokes in a wheel, local offices follow directives and report back to the hub, which is the national headquarters in New York City. The ADL portrays itself as a Jewish civil liberties organization dedicated to protecting Jews from anti-Semitism. As we will see in this video, its long-term goal is to silence Christian and conservative political thought. On the 7th floor of this building, information is gathered throughout the Pacific Northwest concerning those the ADL considers a threat to its agenda, or in ADL terminology, those who are prejudiced. Inside, computers store thousands of secret files on right-wing conservative Americans, most of whom may never have committed a crime, except perhaps criticizing the State of Israel. That is why even people's home addresses, driver's licenses, social security numbers, and personal information are listed in these files, so that they can be identified quickly when such so-called prejudice actually comes to be against the law of the land. Such Americans did not give the ADL permission to keep a secret dossier on them, but the ADL does it anyway. It's part of the ADL's database on right-wing organizations, a database which the ADL shares not only with the FBI and Justice Department, but with local police, such as here in King County. Like the ancient Pharisees, whom Christ described as whitewashed on the outside, the ADL gives the impression of a Jewish civil liberties organization with high-minded intentions. Yet inside these walls are persons with a very different goal, not the elimination of hate, but the eventual elimination of free expression of Christian conservative values. Here is how the ADL has been working to achieve that goal. During 1988, the ADL initiated a nationwide law student competition to write a model anti-hate law for America. This law would criminalize not just physical acts of racial violence, but statements that might lead to violence. On April 20th through the 22nd of 1988, the ADL helped sponsor a conference at New York's prestigious Hofstra University. It was entitled Group Defamation and Freedom of Speech, the Relationship Between Language and Violence. The winner of the hate crimes competition was announced as Joseph Ribicoff, a law student from Whittier College in California. The invitation to draft a group libel statute was a serious national competition with students from the finest law schools in America competing. As such, when the ADL gave first prize to Joseph Ribicoff above many rivals, it tells us that the ADL jury liked very much what Ribicoff proposed. They saw Ribicoff's hard-line legislative approach to group libel as a direction they wanted to explore. This is obvious because the second and third place winners were not nearly so harsh and repressive of free speech as Ribicoff. Let's review what the ADL found so agreeable within Ribicoff's proposal. First, Ribicoff asserts that just banning acts of hate-motivated violence is not enough. The words that stimulate suspicion, friction, hate, and possible violence must also be criminalized. Yet what are words but the outward expression of ideas? Ribicoff wants to ban those seed ideas which might conceivably be used as a pretext for bigotry and violence. To enforce this ban on ideas, the ADL clearly favors Ribicoff's next proposal, state censorship. According to Ribicoff, state agencies should not only monitor and restrict free speech in general, but should censor all movies and videotapes that criticize identifiable groups.
Any person, persons, or organization that publicly shows a film or movie before it has been submitted and reviewed by the agency shall have committed a misdemeanor.
A misdemeanor means a crime. A crime committed requires a law enforcement, legal, and penal establishment capable of punishing that crime. Again, the ADL looks with favor upon such law enforcement bureaucracy to prevent thought crimes. In Canada, if one is accused of defaming an identifiable group and confesses quickly, he may be fined up to $5,000 and serve up to 2 years in prison. If he does not confess his guilt, he will be embroiled in costly legal entanglements. If he loses, he will again have to face fines and possible imprisonment. Because the ADL gave first prize to such a system of harassment and prosecution, there is every indication that the ADL is delighted with Ribicoff's get-tough proposals to criminalize thought crimes. But Ribicoff and the ADL want even more. Ribicoff stipulates that anyone who is a member of an organization that has shown an unapproved film will also be criminalized. This means, for example, that if a large anti-homosexual American organization, such as Pat Robertson's Christian Coalition, produces a video critical of homosexuality, all of its tens of thousands of members may be indicted if they remain members. Refusal to abandon their loyalty will become contempt of court, and prison will follow. Not just the leadership, but also every single member who remains loyal will be embroiled in court battles. But surely, you may say, if the accused can defend the truth of his statements in court, he should have nothing to fear. Forget it. For Ribicoff, the criteria of guilt or innocence is not truth. Rather, if one verbally humiliates those who have been given federal status as members of a protected group, then group libel has occurred. This is what he means when he says, regulating group defamation is status-based, not content-based. The truth of the content of that so-called libel does not matter. It will not be admitted as evidence in court. Again, we should note that the other law students who won first and second honorable mention were not as extreme as Ribicoff. For example, Devin House, the second honorable mention, wants to outlaw group libel, but also wants truth to be the basis for acquittal, just as it is in conventional libel cases. Heidi Bakana, first honorable mention, respects truth and also wants to define group libel as a false statement whose intent is not just to communicate, but also to inflict harm. For Ribicoff, there is no such provision for truth. The only vital question in group libel laws is whether or not a group has felt emotionally damaged as a result of being criticized. If it does, group libel has occurred. Clearly, Ribicoff's proposal, favored by the ADL, is a fiendish scheme to destroy from top to bottom Christian power as an effective force in the world. The ADL Hofstra Conference was no mere academic exercise. As a result of the foundation of research and debate it laid down, the ADL created its own model anti-hate law. During the early 90s, many state legislatures used the ADL model as a pattern for the creation of their own anti-hate laws. Such local statutes redefined prejudice and greatly stiffened penalties against biased crimes. It is noteworthy that the Justice Department, in its present police anti-hate training guidelines, praises the ADL's role in crafting the model legislation we have been discussing. If the ADL's anti-hate laws are enacted, will the new Justice Department, under Bush, continue to lend its prestige to the ADL's anti-hate agenda? Although the participants in the ADL's Hofstra Conference were divided concerning the feasibility of such blatant censorship, the ADL remained determined that some kind of anti-hate legislation become law. Thus, the ADL helped create the Hate Crime Statistic Act, which was passed by Congress in 1990. The Hate Crime Statistic Act requires states to determine if crimes committed under their jurisdiction are motivated by prejudice. These include serious crimes, but also such relatively minor offenses as vandalism, trespass, and threat. Local law enforcement are required to relay such information to a federal anti-hate data bank, then to be shared with law enforcement officials throughout the nation.
Thus, if a homosexual is the victim of an offense as minor as vandalism, trespass, or threat, states are forced to determine if the offense were motivated by prejudice, a highly problematical and even tedious task. If so, details of the homosexual's case are to be forwarded to the federal government. If the person or group who committed the crime had not yet been found, the government's policy of sharing information concerning the case with state and local agencies might help to apprehend such persons. Thus, the long arm of the federal government could come to the aid of a homosexual victim in a way that would be out of the question for victims of crimes not motivated by prejudice.
But the ADL wants the Justice Department to do more than simply record and share data. It wants federal prosecution of those who hate. So far, this has not been fully possible because the federal government lacks authority to, 1, fully define for the states what constitutes a violent hate crime, especially in regard to homosexuality. This bill would have given homosexuality virtually the same protection which race, religion, and gender now enjoy. 2, determine the penalty for a violent hate crime. 3, invade states' rights in law enforcement, except in 6 special circumstances, such as jury tampering, voting fraud, interstate commerce, and so on. If the Local Law Enforcement Enhancement Act of 2000 had been passed, the federal government would no longer have been restricted in its right to intervene in racial, religious, or ethnic violence on the state level. Nor would homosexuals any longer be without special federal protection. This act would have vastly increased the government's right to, 1, define a violent hate crime, especially as it applies to homosexuals. 2, determine and enhance punishment for violent hate crimes. 3, at will invade state jurisdictions to enforce anti-hate laws.
This bill would have been a stepping stone toward an anti-hate bureaucracy. Eventually, Christian teachings condemning sodomy could be considered hateful. Fortunately, as a result of national alerts by Christian conservative leaders such as Dr. D. James Kennedy, a Republican House of Representatives was able to recognize the danger in this bill and defeat it. Yet the ADL never gives up. In 2001, a new, nearly identical bill was reintroduced to further the ADL agenda of ending free speech in America. Of course, this new bill, S-622, does not hint that its ultimate objective is to end free speech. Rather, it requires federal jurisdiction and stiffer penalties only for violent hate crimes. Surely everyone agrees that violent crimes of hate, such as the Oklahoma City bombing, should be severely punished. Yet if S-622 is passed, in a few years the ADL will orchestrate further legislation to achieve its true objectives. Tomorrow's legislation will amend S-622 to include hurtful speech as a hate crime. Such speech will be dramatized as the underlying cause of hate-motivated violence. Such thought crimes will then be prosecuted under a federal law enforcement apparatus originally set up only to punish physical acts of hate-motivated violence.
If hurtful speech is outlawed, power over the accused will be in the hands of those who define what hurtful speech is. If it means criticizing an identifiable group of people, then such criticism will be against the law. What is hurtful speech? Under existing laws, verbal threat against the safety of persons or groups is called harassment or intimidation. Such threat is adequately criminalized under state law. Why isn't the ADL content with such state laws? Because they don't outlaw the ADL's true enemy. The ADL's enemies are those like my wife and myself, who, out of love for the Jewish people, are morally obligated to criticize Zionism's bad leadership and false teachings. Yet the ADL wants to transform any criticism of matters Jewish into anti-Semitism, a form of hate. For the ADL, the criteria of whether a crime or even an editorial is anti-Semitic is whether it contains anti-Jewish criticism. Thus, in congressional testimony promoting anti-hate laws, the ADL says, anti-Jewish statements constitute clear evidence of anti-Semitism. Of course, Jesus and the Old Testament prophets scathingly tongue-lashed the people of Israel for their sins. If the ADL definition of anti-Semitism is correct, and criticizing Jews and their religion is hateful, then Christ and the biblical prophets were among the most outspoken anti-Semites the world has ever known. Instead, they resorted to verbally violent language in hopes that such tough love would shock the Jews into repentance and save their souls. Yet if the ADL has its way, the modern counterpart of the Old Testament prophets, those who out of concern for Israel criticize it for its sins, could become guilty of hate crimes. Christian missionary organizations which criticize Judaism for rejecting its Messiah and attempt to convert Jews away from it could eventually be indicted as haters. For the ADL, little has changed since those who criticized the Jewish people were stoned.
Thus, while promoting freedom for Jews, the ADL has a proven record of subtly working to limit freedom for others. Ultimately, the ADL will pressure the government to extend the term hate crime to include hurtful words against identifiable groups. Anyone who heckled marchers in a gay pride parade would then have committed a criminal act. Ultimately, even pastors who heaped guilt and shame upon sinners might be open to the charge of hurtful words.
You may ask, what possible motivation could this Jewish civil liberties organization have for curtailing free speech? The answer lies in the ambitions and destiny of Israel.
The biblical prophets, such as Isaiah, foretold a day when Judaism will no longer be accosted with opposition and criticism. The role of the ADL for the last 3/4 of a century has been to help create such a worldwide, criticism-free zone for Israel. Israel's first Prime Minister, David Ben-Gurion, in a Look magazine article, gives us more than a hint of the new world order presided over by Israel, which Zionism and the ADL are working to create. All continents will become united in a world alliance, at whose disposal will be an international police force. All armies will be abolished, and there will be no more war. In Jerusalem, the United Nations, a truly United Nations, will build a shrine of the prophets to serve the federated union of all continents. This will be the seat of the Supreme Court of mankind to settle all controversies among the federated continents, as prophesied by Isaiah. Describing the aspirations of Zionism, Sir Winston Churchill, writing in the Illustrated Sunday Herald of February 8, 1920, also presents what amounts to a prophetic description of how the ADL would someday be assaulting freedom. It may well be that this same astounding race may at the present time be in the actual process of producing another system of morals and philosophy as malevolent as Christianity was benevolent, which, if not arrested, would shatter irretrievably all that Christianity had rendered possible. It would almost seem as if the gospel of Christ and the gospel of Antichrist were destined to originate among the same people.
Few Americans realize that already in such countries as Sweden, West Germany, Britain, Israel, and Canada, laws banning hurtful words against groups of people are already on the books. In Canada, if we follow a 25-year-old paper trail of newspaper articles, court documents, and articles in the Jewish press, we find again and again two organizations which have played the pivotal role in making hate laws happen. They are the Canadian colleagues of the Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith Canada, and the Canadian Jewish Congress. Other groups may be involved in the externals of anti-hate lobbying, yet both behind the scenes and in the forefront, the Canadian Jewish Congress and B'nai B'rith Canada provide the focus and energy for Canada's rapidly evolving thought crime statutes. As a result of their tireless lobbying efforts, the Canadian Parliament in 1971 banned all written or broadcast statements which seek to cause humiliation to certain identifiable groups.
Under such laws, Dr. Paul Cameron, nationally recognized opponent of gay rights, made arrangements for a public lecture in Canada in which the homosexual lifestyle would be criticized. When he arrived at the border, the cases of books and literature he brought with him were impounded. He was told that in Canada it is against the law to humiliate homosexuals publicly.
As anti-hate legislation goes before Congress, the media continue to focus on racial violence, holding up the Aryan nations, the Ku Klux Klan, and skinheads as examples of what society should outlaw. Yet it is you and I, thinking Christians of a conservative bent of mind, who are in danger of being silenced. While gays, communists, abortionists, and radical feminists are not seen as those who hate, every kind of right-winger from Jerry Falwell to the Aryan nations is increasingly perceived as a source of hurtful words. In fact, Christianity itself is coming under scrutiny as a source of hate. Christianity, because of its belief in absolutes of right and wrong, is increasingly viewed as intolerant and judgmental.
A major reason why anti-hate legislation is so dangerous is that the definition of prejudice, the condition it claims to oppose, is ambiguous. A pastor would not think it a form of prejudice to warn a homosexual from his deviant, soul-damning lifestyle. Yet gay rights groups and the ADL would. Testimony of the ADL before Congress makes it clear that the ADL is pushing hard for national acceptance of its definitions. The ADL would prefer that, number one, federal definitions of prejudice be modeled after the point of view of the ADL. Number two, law enforcement personnel should defer to ADL definitions of prejudice when filling out reports on criminal investigations. And three, law enforcement personnel should submit themselves to ADL-led sensitivity training, making them compliant with ADL definitions of prejudice. Further, the ADL requests from Congress that investigating officers should be allowed to determine before trial whether the accused is motivated by prejudice. This would set up the local police, assisted by the ADL guidelines, as a sort of preliminary jury. This power over the accused is very ominous, because if prejudice is determined, the ADL wants the crime considered much more serious, with a stiffer sentence.
Clearly, anti-hate legislation is an opportunity for the ADL to intimidate and manipulate Americans. As stated earlier, the ADL exerted relentless pressure upon the Canadian government to ban group defamation. They succeeded. Now, Canadians are in danger of prosecution if they criticize homosexuality publicly, or even state publicly that gays have a higher rate of AIDS than anyone else. In America, the ADL is working even harder. Their initial intention is not to ban free speech entirely, but to convince us that certain forms of speech can be outlawed without doing violence to freedom of expression in general. Incredibly, despite its Orwellian overtones, this legislation has encountered little significant opposition. Few recognize it as the foundation upon which a system of police-state spying and censorship can be built. Throughout the last three-quarters of a century, the ADL has justified its incredible power in the following way. It says that since hatred and intolerance are a huge and complicated problem, a very complex and even powerful watchdog organization is necessary to keep tabs on it. If there had been an ADL in Germany, we are told, there would have been no Holocaust against the Jews. The ADL clearly means business, and that business involves increasing restraint of the free speech of Christians and conservatives. It also means spying on such Americans. Let's turn our attention now to what the ADL above me is doing at this moment, and how that affects our lives. To do that, we must consider briefly how the ADL came into being.
In 1842, in New York, a Jewish fraternal organization, B'nai B'rith, was founded. Eventually, according to the Encyclopedia Judaica, 2,300 B'nai B'rith lodges would exist worldwide, with 500,000 male and 210,000 female members. In the early 20th century, the propaganda arm of B'nai B'rith was created. The Anti-Defamation League's main purpose was to protect Jews from anti-Semitism. During the 1930s, with the rise of fascism, the ADL began to flex its muscles powerfully. It attacked any real or potential threats to Jewish and eventually Israel's interests. The ADL established an incredibly complex and efficient network of propaganda outlets. These exerted tremendous influence over the way Americans began to view Jewish issues.
Increasingly, the ADL has convinced Americans that any criticism of Jewish behavior or the behavior of the State of Israel bordered on anti-Semitism. It is no accident that today the accusation of anti-Semitism is the kiss of death to the career of any public figure. For more than 3/4 of a century, the ADL has single-handedly influenced every aspect of our society to make criticism of anything Jewish a nearly unforgivable sin. How extensive is the ADL's propaganda and information gathering outreach? Listen to Congressman John Rarick in testimony before Congress in 1971.
The world's largest spy network, the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, is either too powerful to be curbed or too well embedded to be mentioned or to come under public scrutiny. What is the ADL? It is a private investigating organization engaged in spying and preparing secret dossiers and reports, which it uses to suppress free speech and discussion, and to influence public thought and sentiment of an unsuspecting citizenry.
How powerful is the ADL? According to Congressman Rarick, the CIA and the FBI are tinker toys compared to the ADL. In the congressional record, Congressman Rarick quotes the late Senator Jack Tenney of California, who said, "The Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith has become the world's most powerful Gestapo, the brain center of a vast spy network and the intelligence unit of a myriad of Jewish organizations. Their secret agents spy upon American citizens. Extensive files and dossiers are compiled on those whom they dislike. Throughout their multitudinous controls of the media of communications, they are capable of destroying reputations and silencing all rebuttal." A memorandum from the local ADL office charging that a particular candidate is anti-Semitic or supported by someone else alleged to be anti-Semitic is sufficient to defeat that candidate.
The ADL's national headquarters in New York City directs a vast army of informers in its network of regional offices, such as this, tabulating, evaluating, cataloging, and filing information on anti-Semitism.
We are beginning to understand something of the magnitude of the ADL's operation. We are beginning to appreciate its vast spy network sprawling across the nation and throughout the world. Our imagination is staggered by its apparent control of the avenues of communication.
Every ADL office is divided into 2 levels of activity. The most visible is the ADL propaganda program. This favors Jewish and Zionist interests. Through a vast and incredibly complex network of contacts with government, the media, education, cultural organizations, and churches, the ADL endeavors to portray Jews, Judaism, and the State of Israel in a favorable light. On the other hand, those who criticize Jewish behavior or institutions are vilified through these propaganda outlets as haters, bigots, racists, and anti-Semitic creatures so depraved that they should be denied any voice in public life. It is because of the threat posed by such so-called haters that a top priority of the ADL is the creation of anti-hate laws, which will criminalize anyone who criticizes Jewish interests or the State of Israel. The second level of ADL activity is its intelligence arm, or what it calls its fact-finding operations. Over the last 3/4 of a century, the ADL has amassed an enormous file on thousands of Americans whom the ADL suspects are critical of Jewish interests or could be. This file contains the names not just of those visible critics of Israel, but of right-wing conservatives who may, over the years, have given some indication that they disapproved of Zionist behavior. The ADL has made it clear in its writings that it considers all religious, political conservatives to be potential anti-Semites worthy of surveillance. During the early 1990s, the nation had a very rare opportunity to see the cloak pulled off ADL secrecy and to find out how extensive is its spying activity. In the 1980s, the San Francisco and Portland, Oregon police departments illegally created extensive files on right-wing, conservative, white supremacist, and skinhead groups. Ultimately, the Portland files were sent to the Intelligence Division of the San Francisco Police Department. There, they merged with the San Francisco files. An ADL spy, Roy Bullock, was able to obtain the names of these persons and organizations illegally. He did so with the assistance of a San Francisco police officer, Tom Girard. In 1989, the Spotlight newspaper exposed Roy Bullock as an ADL spy. Warrants were obtained and the police searched ADL offices in San Francisco and Los Angeles, plus Bullock's residence. Before we tell you the details of what the police found in this search, you should know that any illegal penetration of police intelligence files or law enforcement computer databases is a felony and conspiracy. Only one conviction of such an offense can send the average citizen to prison. When police accessed Roy Bullock's computer, they found that the ADL and Bullock had indeed penetrated restricted San Francisco Police Department intelligence files and law enforcement computerized databases. In fact, they had violated the law beyond most people's wildest dreams. Although the ADL had obtained illegal information from an officer in the San Francisco Police Department, the department did a very thorough and impartial investigation of how it had been penetrated by the ADL and what the ADL had obtained. Police discovered the ADL possessed over 10,000 names of Americans and organizations, including 6,000 from the political right. These included names from the San Francisco Police intelligence files, but also many names merged from the ADL's own lists. Illegally accessing the Department of Motor Vehicles database, the ADL, through Officer Girard and other cooperating police officers, had obtained 1,394 driver's license numbers. Included was information from private citizens' driver's licenses, including their photos, license plate numbers, and vehicle registration numbers. From the law enforcement database, or rap sheets, the ADL obtained confidential criminal histories, which included much information that could be used for blackmail. The ADL also illegally obtained postal information on many Americans, including post office box numbers. In addition, they obtained confidential immigration information on unsuspecting Americans, plus detailed banking information and personal phone numbers.
Police found many Americans had gotten into the ADL files simply because they had written to a right-wing conservative organization requesting information. Bullock estimated his computerized right-wing file contained the names of about 6,000 people. Some are members of right-wing organizations. Others may only have written to a right-wing organization requesting information. In addition, Bullock's ADL file contained police surveillance photos of persons involved in public demonstrations. The list also included a person's affiliation with other groups or public meetings they had attended. In the same way, Arab Americans who had written a letter to the editor critical of Israel were included. Quoting Police Inspector Roth, "Any Arab American with anti-Israel leanings or any Arab American who wrote letters to the newspaper editors expressing anti-Israel sentiments would be reflected in ADL LA files."
So determined was the ADL spy Roy Bullock to obtain detailed personal information on opponents that he would even search through their garbage. Police found intimate letters of the children of one such family, written to each other and carefully preserved by the ADL. They also discovered that although Bullock had been an employee of the ADL since 1954, the ADL had never paid withholding taxes on him or listed him as an employee. Instead, they financed his spy activities in cash. Ronald Roth, inspector for the San Francisco Police Department in charge of investigating this case, cites no less than 48 probable state income tax felonies committed by the ADL over the 5-year period preceding his raid on ADL files. Roth cites the possibility of 17 different kinds of violations of the penal code which the ADL indulged in, 3 kinds of violation of government code, and 1 kind of violation of the California Vehicle Code. A critical witness concerning the ADL's inner workings was David Gervitz, former fact-finding librarian for the ADL office in Los Angeles. Granted immunity from prosecution, Gervitz admitted under FBI questioning that when he was an ADL employee, there was never any restriction against passing on confidential information to Israel. Such would not have been difficult, according to Gervitz, because staff of the Israeli consulate regularly visited the Los Angeles ADL office, briefing ADL on affairs in Israel. Thus, there is every reason to believe that the Mossad, Israel's super-efficient spy organization, now possesses every name illegally obtained by the ADL in San Francisco and elsewhere around the country. Yet such transfer of information to Israel is only to be expected of the ADL, for the ADL is the American-based propaganda and intelligence division of the Mossad. The ADL spies on Americans in violation of the Foreign Agents Registration Act of 1938 as an unregistered and therefore illegal agent of the State of Israel, lobbying on behalf of Israel's interests. As a result of their theft of police files, the California ADL was subjected to investigation on numerous counts of criminal activity. However, after a year of ADL denials and legal wrangling, this national organization, with an annual budget of $32 million, was fined a paltry $75,000. To add insult to injury of the thousands of Americans whose privacy the ADL had invaded, the court decreed the ADL fine was to be used to combat prejudice in America. Even so, the ADL continued to affirm its innocence. The ADL's national director, Abe Foxman, maintained the same angelic exterior which has stood the ADL so well for so long.
There's nothing we do that is sinister, and there's nothing we do that is against the law.
Incredibly, although the ADL did suffer a public loss of credibility as a result of this scandal, the ADL's political clout and prestige has only increased since then. Under the ultra-liberal leadership of Janet Reno in the Justice Department, the ADL has been exalted to the position of the nation's teacher on how to end prejudice. It was relatively easy for the ADL to access confidential files of the San Francisco Police Department because most police departments and even the FBI often work in close collaboration with the ADL. Since the FBI cannot legally keep a file on persons on account of their political activity, the FBI has come to the ADL for under-the-table information on persons or organizations of interest to them. Thus, the same information on innocent Americans which Bullock gave to the ADL, he also passed on, not only to the FBI, but according to his testimony, to the IRS, the ATF, and even the CIA. In fact, Bullock admitted he was a paid employee of the FBI and had daily phone conversations with law enforcement officers seeking information they could not legally obtain on their own. Such liaison continues to intensify because of FBI and Justice Department encouragement of ADL participation with them. As early as 1985, every FBI field office was ordered by then-Director William Sessions to establish a liaison and line of communication with the ADL. Similarly, the Justice Department has allowed the ADL an integral role in the creation and implementation of anti-hate legislation. In the U.S. Justice Department's Hate Crimes Guidelines for Police Officers, dated October 22, 2000, It describes the ADL in the following glowing terms.
The Anti-Defamation League, ADL, is a human relations organization dedicated to promoting intergroup cooperation and interfaith understanding. Over the past decade, the ADL has become a leading resource in crafting responses to hate violence, including model hate crime legislation, a 17-minute hate crimes training video, a handbook of existing hate crime policies and procedures at both large and small police departments, and a general human relations program for law enforcement.
Such government favoritism is confirmed in the ADL's November 1991 Frontline newsletter, quoted in New American View of May 1992.
The FBI has asked the ADL to play a leading role in its hate crimes training and outreach efforts. Further, the ADL is asked to provide input as hate crime training manuals and data collection are drafted. As a result, according to the ADL newsletter, ADL Washington representatives have participated in FBI-sponsored regional hate crime training conferences for law enforcement officials from more than 300 of the nation's largest cities and counties.
The ADL now provides police with anti-hate training manuals. In these, the ADL is given the privilege of defining what constitutes prejudice or crimes of prejudice. Further, the ADL is helping to determine punishment for a crime of prejudice. How severe should punishment for hate crimes be? Since the ADL considers any prejudice against Jews, blacks, or gays to be very bad, they have convinced law enforcement, most state legislatures, the Justice Department, and even Congress that hate crimes deserve a much stiffer sentence than ordinary crimes of violence. Worse yet, the ADL is grooming law enforcement in the United States to become its private Gestapo. David Gervitz, the ADL's former librarian in Los Angeles, frankly told FBI investigators that the ADL seeks to curry favor with police. If the police prove cooperative, especially if they provide privileged information, they are often rewarded with all expenses paid trips to Israel.
According to San Francisco police investigator Roth, Gervitz was aware that periodically the ADL sponsors and pays all expenses for trips to Israel for police officers as a way of developing liaison with them and expressing gratitude for their assistance. In the same way, according to Roth, in May of 1991, Detective Carroll of the San Diego Sheriff's Office Special Investigation Unit, Tom Girard, and 9 other law enforcement officers went on an ADL-sponsored trip to Israel. Detective Carroll said that this all-expense-paid trip was more or less a thank-you gift and a liaison gesture by the ADL to continue the close relationship it has with specific law enforcement officers in the United States.
Yet the ADL wants to provide American police with more than just rest and recreation in Israel. It wants to re-educate American law enforcement officers in Israel, sending them home as the forerunners of the new thought police in America. In its May 1992 issue, the New American View continues to describe the ADL takeover of the U.S. law enforcement establishment.
Last month, the Jerusalem Post reported that a delegation of New Jersey state police and prosecutors, led by Assistant Attorney James Mulvihill, had completed over 2 weeks of training by Israel's elite anti-terrorist units and had established permanent lines of collaboration with them. The New Jersey delegation was the latest of at least a half dozen such junkets to Israel for American police departments, all set up and paid for by the ADL since 1980.
This article continues to describe how American law enforcement is now looking to the ADL and Israel for guidance in how to enforce the ADL hate crime agenda. In its April 1990 bulletin, the ADL boasted that the International Association of Chiefs of Police held its annual meeting in Jerusalem. The Jerusalem Post said that this was the first time in its 100-year history that the session was convened outside of America. Although the ADL trips to Israel we have referred to occurred throughout the 80s and early 90s, the ADL has never admitted anything improper by such favors to American police. Neither has it promised not to repeat such trips in the future. In fact, the Washington Post of October 19, 1993 says, "The ADL views its special police missions to Israel as another intensive training activity, giving officers a chance to meet top Israeli police, intelligence officers, and political leaders."